Nietzsche is one of the greatest philosophers ever, and Stoicism one of the greatest philosophies ever, so it's no wonder that we might be curious about his opinion on Stoicism. In the course of his career, Nietzsche mentions Stoicism quite a few times. I've seen some people argue that Nietzsche hates Stoicism, and other people, such as Martha Nussbaum, argue that he's in fact some kind of closet Stoic. In this episode, we're going to explore Nietzsche's complex relationship with Stoicism in all its nuances of affirmation and denial. The argument that Nietzsche hates the Stoics comes from some strong sentiments that he makes about them. There's one aphorism in Beyond Good and Evil where he really goes after their interpretation of nature, and it's nature according to the Stoics. And that harsh language has led some to believe that he's a hater of Stoicism, but that's just Nietzsche slinging arrows around. He does that quite a lot. But there is a back and forth relationship there. He doesn't hate them, but it's not that he loves them either. He has a sort of begrudging respect for Stoicism, and in one of his earlier writings, Untimely Meditations, we find him praising the dedication and the discipline of the Stoics. No one dares to fulfill the law of philosophy in himself. No one lives philosophically with that simple manly loyalty that compelled an ancient, if he had once declared loyalty to the Stoa, to act as a Stoic wherever he was and whatever he did. Contrast this with the force of conviction with which the ancient Stoic believed in the cosmos and in the rationality of the cosmos. And later on in his writings we find a lot of praise for the Stoics in contrast to Christianity. And though the both of them have emerged out of the decadence of a high civilization, they're two very different reactions. In praising Epicurus in contrast to Christianity, he says, "The most beautiful thing, however, is that a fear of God is totally alien to him, that he believes rigorously in reason, that he is not a preacher of penitence." And later in the notebooks that became the Will to Power, he says, "Two types of morality must not be confused. The morality with which the healthy instinct defends itself against incipient decadence, and another morality with which this very decadence defines and justifies itself and leads downwards. The former is usually stoical, hard, tyrannical. Stoicism itself was such a break-shoe morality. The latter is enthusiastic, sentimental, full of secrets. It has the women and beautiful feelings on its side. Primitive Christianity was such a morality." So the difference between Stoicism and Christianity on this reading, it's a degree of healthiness. There's still something noble about Stoicism. It also emerges out of decadence, that's true, but it's like a brake shoe. And a brake shoe is the brake on a train. It's that bit pressing down on the wheel to slow it down. And that's what Stoicism is to ancients. You can think of Seneca and Cato the Younger as exemplaries of that Roman aristocracy, of the high civilization of a noble society. And they use Stoicism to slow down that decadence. And I think that's why Stoicism has become so popular in modern times, is that we have the excesses and the chaotic overflow of high civilization, and we want to slow that down. We want to get a little bit of inner peace, and that's where we're inclined to turn towards Stoicism, especially now that Christianity has kind of started to wither away, and Stoicism still has that appeal of being rational. We're looking to put a break on the modern excesses, just like those Romans were, and we're looking to calm ourselves down. We're looking to find that peace. So we're using Stoicism as that brake shoe against the excesses of modern living. The third strain of praise that we find for Stoicism in Nietzsche, although this is kind of mixed, is their connection with Heraclitus. Now, Heraclitus is Nietzsche's favourite, I think it's probably his favourite philosopher ever. He says that in his proximity I feel warmer and better than anywhere else. So Nietzsche has this undiluted love for Heraclitus, and he sees that the Stoics are the imitators of Heraclitus, they're the inheritors of that doctrine, and especially there's a very interesting connection which should eliminate any idea that Nietzsche hates Stoicism, and that's the fact that they were the first ones really to come up with the idea of the eternal recurrence, which he sees as an emergence out of Heraclitus thinking with the panther ray, you can't step in the same river twice. And the eternal recurrence is one of Nietzsche's greatest doctrines, is one of the doctrines he loves most, one of those ideas and inspirations that came to him that really transformed his life and has such meaning for him. So to connect Stoicism with that, you can see that it's very far from being a hateful relationship. But despite this connection with Heraclitus, there's still the sense that Stoicism has watered it down, that Stoicism has tried to make Heraclitus appeal to the masses, and that's again something that grates with Nietzsche's sense of the order of rank and the distance of pathos, and creating that kind of distance between the lofty and the lower, kind of in line with the sort of aristocratic vision of Plato's Republic. So he feels that Stoicism has kind of democratized, I suppose, Heraclitus' writings, and that doesn't totally sit well with Nietzsche. So it's not an unqualified adulation of Stoicism, but we see that there are strains there where he's certainly got a lot of respect for them. He respects that discipline. He respects there's the element of nobility in Stoicism and the rationalism. But that being said, the overarching theme of Stoicism is very much at odds with Nietzsche's philosophy. Stoicism is almost the epitome of Apollonian restraint and discipline, and that contrasts obviously with Nietzsche's tragic vision and of the Dionysian philosopher. What's interesting with Nietzsche's attitude to Stoicism is that he doesn't dismiss it entirely. He says that perhaps there are places where it's appropriate, but in general, for his life, and perhaps for the life of all of us decadents, that this might be the better way. His way of being the Dionysian tragic philosopher might be the greater philosophy. This philosophy is one of excess. It's one of embracing the roller coaster, the highs and the lows. And in line with Heraclitus, it's embracing becoming with all of our being. We see him talk about this in Ecce Homo, his autobiography, in the last book he wrote. And he's reflecting back on The Birth of Tragedy, the first book he wrote. I have the right to understand myself as the first tragic philosopher. Before me, this transposition of the Dionysian into a philosophical pathos did not exist. Tragic wisdom was lacking. The affirmation of passing away and destroying, which is the decisive feature of a Dionysian philosophy, saying yes to opposition and war, becoming, along with a radical repudiation of the very concept of being, all this is clearly more closely related to me than anything else thought to date. So this is the backdrop against which we have to understand Nietzsche's relationship to Stoicism. There can be respect for it as being a different school of philosophy. And Nietzsche's not a universal democratic kind of thinker. Anyway, he doesn't want everyone to share his philosophy. It's for a very particular people. The approach of Stoicism is completely different to Nietzsche's approach. He calls the Stoicism approach hedgehog-skinned. It's more of a defensive approach, a pulling back in, a withdrawing, whereas his is an expanding into life, an opening out. Morality, essentially a shield, a means of defense. To this extent, a sign of the immature, armoured, stoical. The mature man has, above all, weapons. He attacks. But again, with that being said, for Nietzsche there are, as I've mentioned, particular places in which Stoicism might be the natural philosophy that we gravitate towards. So if our environment drives us a certain direction, then Stoicism might be the better reaction than this tragic philosophy. The tragic philosophy might be more associated with it, the aristocratic, the order of rank, the pathos of distance that is associated with Nietzsche and his free spirits. But if his life conditions were different, then maybe Stoicism will be the better choice. The Stoic trains himself to swallow stones and worms, slivers of glass and scorpions without nausea. He wants his stomach to become ultimately indifferent to whatever the accidents of existence might pour into it. For those with whom fate attempts improvisations, those who live in violent ages and depend on sudden and mercurial people, Stoicism may indeed be advisable. But anyone who foresees more or less that fate permits him to spin a long thread does well to make Epicurean arrangements. That is what all those have always done whose work is of the spirit. For this type, it would be the loss of losses to be deprived of their subtle irritability and be awarded in its place a hard, stoic hedgehog skin. So this goes completely against what Martha Nussbaum argues in her article on Nietzsche's connection with Stoicism. And she's looking there at the connection between pity and mercy, and she sees Nietzsche as this sort of closet stoic, and it's kind of bizarre. She sees him as an anti-tragic philosopher, this guy who proclaims himself the first tragic philosopher, the Dionysian philosopher. In some sense, it's kind of bizarre, and you wonder how she missed the wood for the trees with that one so much. But she sees him as being in line with the Stoic project of the extirpation of the passions. And there's one particular passage in Nietzsche that for me blows this out of the water, and I've been thinking, and I think this is my favourite passage from Nietzsche anywhere in his writings. It's from The Gay Science, and it's the total embrace of life and the yes saying to life, which is so amazing. On the aim of science. The aim of science should be to give men as much pleasure and as little displeasure as possible. But what if pleasure and displeasure were so tied together that whoever wanted to have as much as possible of one must also have as much as possible of the other? That whoever wanted to learn to jubilate up to the heavens would also have to be prepared for depression unto death? And that is how things may well be. At least the Stoics believed that this was how things were, and they were consistent when they also desired as little pleasure as possible in order to get as little displeasure as possible out of life. To this day you have the choice, either as little displeasure as possible, painlessness in brief, And in the last analysis, socialists and politicians of all parties have no right to promise their people more than that, or as much displeasure as possible, as the price for the growth of an abundance of subtle pleasures and joys that have rarely been relished yet. If you decide for the former and desire to diminish and lower the level of human pain, you also have to diminish and lower the level of their capacity for joy. Actually, science can promote either goal. So far, it may still be better known for its power of depriving man of his joys and making him colder, more like a statue, more stoic. But it might yet be found to be the great dispenser at pain, and then its counterforce might be found at the same time, its immense capacity for making new galaxies of joy flare up. This is ultimately Nietzsche's position on Stoicism. It's a retreating, it's pulling your feet back from the fire, it's turning off the crucible rather than maintaining that pressure, maintaining that ultimate tension of the opposites, and seeing what kind of transformation, seeing what becoming emerges out of that pressure cooker. Where the Stoics pull back from these things, Nietzsche affirms them. He wants to throw himself wholeheartedly into that. But that being said, his Dionysian tragic philosophy requires, as he says earlier about the Epicureans, it requires that fate allows him to spin a long thread. If he lived in times of greater chaos or greater privation, then maybe Stoicism would be the better path for Nietzsche. So that's really what it boils down to, is that there are times when Stoicism might be appropriate, but given the right conditions, the tragic Dionysian philosophy is the noblest philosophy, and it is the one to pursue, and that is why he speaks so highly of it, and that's why he's so taken with it. So while he retains that option for taking Stoicism at some point, for now he asks us, finally, regarding the prescription of all these physicians of the soul and their praise of a hard radical cure, it should be permitted to ask, is our life really painful and burdensome enough to make it advantageous to exchange it for a Stoic way of life and petrification? We are not so badly off that we have to be as badly off as Stoics. So in conclusion, I'd say that Nietzsche definitely didn't hate Stoicism. He saw that there was a position for Stoicism if the conditions of life required it, but that for those of us who have bread on the table and the rot of decadence seeping into us, then maybe Stoicism isn't the best option. In being assailed by these excesses of high civilization, perhaps a better option is to throw ourselves right into the deep end. Decadence wants to disconnect us from the instincts, disconnect us from the emotions, but perhaps we should throw ourselves into those waters and embrace the lessons that emotionality can teach us. That's very much in keeping in line with his Dionysian philosophy in general. So that's everything that I wanted to cover on today's episode of The Living Philosophy. If you've enjoyed it, please subscribe if you haven't already. If you have any comments, thought, or feedback, I'd love to hear from you down in the comments. Otherwise, I shall see you next time, guys. Thanks for watching.